At 3:17 a.m., 12-year-old Isabella Whitmore's screams pierce through the marble halls of the $40 million Manhattan penthouse as she claws at her chest, gasping for air that won't come, while her billionaire father stands helplessly in the doorway, watching his daughter's fourth panic attack this week tear her apart. Before we continue, if you enjoy incredible true stories of healing and hope, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Richard Whitmore had conquered Wall Street, built an empire worth $3 billion, and commanded respect from world leaders. But nothing in his arsenal of power and influence could stop his daughter's nightly terror. Isabella's panic attacks had begun 6 months after her mother's sudden death in a car accident, and they were getting worse. Each night brought the same horrifying routine: the shallow breathing, the trembling hands, the desperate pleas for help that no amount of money seemed able to answer. The Whitmore penthouse occupied the entire top floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of Central Park. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over priceless artwork, and Italian marble floors reflected the opulence that money could buy. But luxury meant nothing when your child was suffering. Isabella's bedroom alone cost more than most people's homes, decorated with custom furniture from Paris and hand-painted murals depicting fairy tale scenes that now seemed to mock the nightmare her life had become. Dr. Margaret Foster, the city's most renowned child psychiatrist, had tried everything: cognitive behavioral therapy, breathing exercises, meditation apps, even experimental treatments that cost $20,000 per session. Isabella had been prescribed 3 different medications, none of which touched the core of her terror. The attacks always followed the same pattern. They began around midnight with restless tossing, escalated into hyperventilation by 2 a.m., and reached their peak in the early morning hours when Isabella would wake screaming, convinced she was dying. For Richard had fired 4 nannies in 6 months. Each one came highly recommended, with pristine references and decades of experience caring for wealthy families. But when faced with Isabella's attacks, they all proved inadequate. Mrs. Henderson, a stern British woman who had raised 3 generations of aristocrats, quit after Isabella's screaming gave her stress-induced migraines. Maria, a warm Colombian woman with a psychology degree, lasted 2 months before admitting she was out of her depth. The others barely made it through their first week. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Richard sat in his mahogany-paneled study, reviewing resumes for the 5th round of potential nannies, when his personal assistant knocked softly. "Mr. Whitmore, there's one more candidate here to see you. I know it's late, but she insisted she could help Isabella." The woman who entered was not what Richard expected. Serafina Vale appeared to be in her early 30s, with striking amber eyes and auburn hair that caught the lamplight like spun gold. She moved with quiet confidence, wearing a simple navy dress that suggested elegance without ostentation. But it was something else that caught Richard's attention, a sense of calm that seemed to radiate from her presence, as if she carried peace within her and could share it with others. "Mr. Whitmore," Serafina said, her voice soft but clear, "I understand your daughter is in pain." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, studying this unexpected candidate. Her resume was impressive but unconventional. She had degrees in both child psychology and music therapy, with additional certifications in trauma counseling and alternative healing methods. She had worked with children in war zones, survivors of natural disasters, and kids who had lost parents. But most intriguingly, she had spent 3 years studying with Tibetan monks, learning ancient techniques for calming the mind and healing emotional wounds. "Miss Vale," Richard began, "I'll be direct. My daughter has panic attacks every night. The best doctors in the city haven't been able to help her. 4 nannies have quit. What makes you think you can do what they couldn't?" Serafina met his gaze steadily. "Because I understand that panic is not just fear of the present moment. It's fear of being alone with pain that feels too big to bear. Your daughter isn't just having attacks. She's reliving the moment she lost her mother every single night. The terror she feels isn't random. It's her heart trying to process a grief so profound that her young mind can't comprehend it." Richard felt something shift in his chest. No one had ever described Isabella's condition with such clarity, such understanding. "The doctors say it's acute anxiety disorder." "The doctors are treating symptoms," Serafina replied gently. "I want to treat the wound, but I need to warn you, my methods are different. I don't rely on medication or traditional therapy alone. I use techniques that might seem unusual, but they work because they address the child's spirit as well as their mind." That night, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He hired Serafina Vale on the spot, driven by a desperation that had been growing for months, and an inexplicable faith in this woman who seemed to see his daughter's pain with perfect clarity. Serafina moved into the penthouse the next morning, taking the guest suite adjacent to Isabella's room. She brought very few belongings: Some books on healing and child psychology, a small collection of musical instruments including a Celtic harp, several glass vials containing what appeared to be oils and herbs, and a large collection of smooth, stones in various colors and sizes. Isabella was immediately suspicious of the new nanny. At 12, she was intelligent beyond her years, sharpened by loss and made wary by the parade of caregivers who had promised to help but ultimately failed. Her. She watched Serafina unpack with dark eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. "Are you going to leave too?" Isabella asked bluntly, standing in the doorway of Serafina's room. Serafina turned from her unpacking and smiled, the expression transforming her face with genuine warmth. "I'm not going anywhere, Isabella, not unless you ask me to leave." They all said that. I'm sure they did, but I'm different, and I can prove it. Serafina reached into one of her bags and pulled out a small, perfectly smooth stone that seemed to glow with inner light. "This is a moonstone. It's supposed to help with nightmares and protect people while they sleep. Would you like to hold it?" Isabella approached cautiously as if the stone might bite her, but when she touched it, her eyes widened slightly. The stone was warm, almost alive in her palm, and holding it seemed to slow her racing heartbeat just a fraction. "It's warm," Isabella whispered. "That's because it's absorbing your worry," Serafina explained. "Stones are very old, Isabella. They've seen every kind of sadness and joy that exists. This one wants to help carry some of your sadness for a while, so you don't have to carry it all alone." For the first time in months, Isabella didn't scoff at an adult's attempt to comfort her. There was something different about Serafina, something that made Isabella feel less alone in her pain. The first week passed with surprising calm. Serafina established a routine that felt natural rather than forced. She woke early to prepare Isabella's breakfast, not just any breakfast, but meals crafted with ingredients known to support emotional well-being, chamomile tea instead of coffee, lavender honey on fresh bread, berries rich in antioxidants that help the brain process stress. She walked Isabella to school, picking her up personally rather than sending a driver, and filled the car rides with gentle conversation about everything except the attacks. But most importantly, Serafina was present. She didn't try to fix Isabella immediately or overwhelm her with treatment. Instead, she simply existed in Isabella's space with a calm energy that gradually began to influence the entire penthouse. Even Richard noticed the difference. The house felt less tense, less charged with unspoken anxiety. The real test came on Isabella's first night with Serafina. As midnight approached, Isabella began the familiar descent into panic. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the shortness of breath, the overwhelming certainty that something terrible was about to happen. But before the attack could fully take hold, she heard something unexpected, a soft, melodic whisper coming from the other room. Serafina was singing, her voice barely audible through the walls, but somehow Isabella could hear every word. It wasn't a song Isabella recognized, but the melody was ancient and soothing, like a lullaby her soul remembered from some distant dream. The words were in a language Isabella didn't understand, but their meaning was clear. You are safe, you are loved, you are not alone. As the whispered song continued, Isabella felt her breathing begin to slow. The crushing weight on her chest started to lift, replaced by something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. She found herself moving toward the sound, padding barefoot across the marble floor until she reached Serafina's door, which stood slightly ajar. Serafina sat cross-legged on her bed, eyes closed, hands resting gently on the Celtic harp in her lap. She wasn't just singing, she was creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to wrap around Isabella like protective arms. The moonstone. Isabella had been holding glowed softly in the dark room, pulsing in rhythm with Serafina's voice. "I can't sleep," Isabella whispered from the doorway. Serafina opened her eyes and smiled, never pausing in her gentle song. She patted the space beside her on the bed, and Isabella climbed up, curling into the warm circle of music and safety. As Serafina's whispered lullaby continued, Isabella felt herself drifting towards sleep for the first time in months without fear. The whispered song became their nightly ritual. Every evening at bedtime, Serafina would begin her soft singing, sometimes with the harp, sometimes with just her voice, always with the same healing intention. She sang ancient Celtic songs her grandmother had taught her, Tibetan mantras she had learned in the mountains, and lullabies from cultures around the world that carried the universal message of comfort and protection. But Serafina's healing approach went far deeper than music. During the day, she introduced Isabella to techniques she called fear alchemy, ways of transforming terror into understanding. They would sit together in the penthouse's garden room, surrounded by plants and natural light, while Serafina taught Isabella how to breathe with intention, how to ground herself when anxiety began to rise, and most importantly, how to speak to her fear instead of being consumed by it. "Fear isn't your enemy, Isabella," Serafina explained during one of their afternoon sessions. Fear is a messenger. It's trying to tell you something important. Your panic attacks aren't random. They're your heart's way of trying to process the loss of your mother. Instead of fighting the fear, we're going to listen to what it's trying to say. These sessions weren't easy. Isabella resisted at first, convinced that nothing could help her. She had built walls around her pain so high that even she couldn't see over them anymore. But Serafina had patience that seemed infinite and a gentleness that gradually coaxed Isabella's trust. 3 weeks into Serafina's stay, Isabella experienced her first full night of sleep without an attack. She woke the next morning confused and almost disappointed. The attacks had become such a constant part of her life that their absence felt strange, like missing something terrible but familiar. "I didn't have an attack last night," Isabella told Serafina over breakfast. "I know," Serafina smiled, placing a plate of French toast drizzled with honey in front of Isabella. "Your body is starting to remember what peace feels like. But what if they come back?" "They might," Serafina said honestly. "Healing isn't a straight line, Isabella, but now you know that peaceful nights are possible. That knowledge changes everything." Richard watched this transformation from a distance, hardly daring to hope. His daughter was laughing again, something he hadn't heard since before Elizabeth's death. Isabella had started eating properly, her color had returned, and most remarkably, she had begun talking about her mother without dissolving into tears. But Richard also noticed changes in himself. Serafina's presence had brought peace, not just to Isabella, but to the entire household. The chronic tension that had gripped him for months began to release. He found himself sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and for the first time since Elizabeth's death, he could imagine a future that included happiness. One evening, Richard found Serafina in the garden room, tending to the plants while Isabella did homework nearby. The scene was so domestic, so naturally peaceful, that it took his breath away. "Miss Vale," he said, "I need to ask you something." Serafina looked up from the orchid she was watering, her amber eyes curious. "How did you know?" Richard continued. "How did you know exactly what Isabella needed when no one else could help her?" Serafina was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I lost my mother when I was 13, she said finally. "Not to death, but to mental illness so severe that she couldn't recognize me anymore. I understand the particular kind of terror that comes from losing the person who was supposed to keep you safe in the world. I know what it feels like to be a child whose foundation has been shattered." Richard felt his chest tighten with recognition. "How did you survive it?" "I had a teacher, an elderly woman who took me in when I had nowhere else to go. She taught me that healing isn't about forgetting pain or pretending it doesn't exist. Healing is about learning to carry your pain in a way that doesn't destroy you. She taught me the songs, the breathing techniques, the stone ceremonies, all the tools I've been sharing with Isabella. And you've dedicated your life to helping other children because of what you went through. Children who are grieving don't need to be fixed," Serafina said. "They need to be understood. They need someone to sit with them in their pain and show them that it's possible to survive it, even transform it into something meaningful." That night, Isabella experienced what Serafina later called a healing crisis, a particularly intense panic attack that seemed to be her body's final attempt to hold on to the trauma. Isabella woke at 2 a.m. screaming and gasping, her body shaking uncontrollably. But this time, instead of feeling helpless, she remembered Serafina's teachings. "Serafina!" Isabella called, her voice raw with panic but also with determination. "I need help, but I want to try something first." Serafina appeared within moments, but instead of rushing to comfort Isabella, she knelt beside her bed and waited. Isabella closed her eyes and began the breathing technique Serafina had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. She held the moonstone in one hand and reached for Serafina's hand with the other. Then, instead of fighting the fear, she spoke to it. "I know you're scared," Isabella whispered to her panic. "I know you miss Mommy. I miss her too, but being scared all the time won't bring her back. And Mommy wouldn't want me to be afraid every night. She would want me to be brave and happy and to remember how much she loved me." As Isabella spoke to her fear, something miraculous happened. The crushing weight on her chest began to lift, but more than that, she felt her mother's presence in the room, not as a source of terror, but as a comforting warmth that surrounded her like a hug. "She's here?" Isabella breathed, wonder replacing panic in her voice. "I can feel her. She's not gone. She's just different now." Serafina squeezed Isabella's hand gently. "She's always been here, sweetheart. Panic was just making so much noise that you couldn't feel her love anymore." From that night forward, Isabella's panic attacks became increasingly rare. When they did occur, they were shorter and less intense, more like waves of sadness than tsunamis of terror. Isabella had learned to see them not as evidence that something was wrong with her, but as part of her ongoing conversation with grief. Over the following months, Serafina introduced Isabella to other healing practices. They created a memory garden on the penthouse terrace, planting flowers that had been Elizabeth's favorites and creating a space where Isabella could feel close to her mother in a positive way. They established worry stones ceremonies, where Isabella could transfer her anxieties to smooth rocks and then release them into the Hudson River, watching her fears dissolve in the flowing water. Most importantly, Serafina taught Isabella that healing didn't mean forgetting her mother or pretending the loss didn't matter. Instead, she learned to carry her love for Elizabeth as a source of strength rather than a source of pain. The transformation was remarkable. Isabella, who had been failing in school due to exhaustion and inability to concentrate, began to excel academically again. She joined the school choir, inspired by Serafina's musical healing approach. She made new friends, something that had been impossible when she was consumed by nightly terror. She laughed frequently and genuinely, no longer the hollow laughter of someone trying to convince themselves they were okay. Richard watched his daughter's resurrection with gratitude so profound it sometimes brought tears to his eyes. But he also found himself facing an unexpected complication. He was falling in love with Serafina. It had happened gradually, so naturally that he hardly noticed at first. Her wisdom, her gentleness, her unwavering commitment to Isabella's well-being had awakened feelings in Richard that he thought had died with Elizabeth. He found himself looking forward to their brief conversations at the end of each day, treasuring the moments when Serafina would update him on Isabella's progress with such genuine care and insight. But Richard was terrified of complicating the healing process. Isabella was just beginning to recover, and the last thing he wanted was to introduce romantic confusion into the delicate balance Serafina had created. So he kept his feelings to himself, even as they grew stronger each day. The crisis came 6 months after Serafina's arrival, on a cold February evening when Isabella had her first panic attack in weeks. It wasn't severe, more of a tremor of anxiety than a full-blown attack, but it triggered something in Richard that he hadn't expected. He found himself in Serafina's room at midnight, pacing frantically while she calmly prepared chamomile tea. "I can't lose her," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I can't watch her suffer again. What if the attacks come back? What if she gets worse? What if—" "Richard," Serafina said gently, using his first name for the first time. "Stop. Breathe." She guided him through the same breathing technique she used with Isabella, her hand steady on his shoulders as he fought to control his own panic. In that moment, Richard realized that he had been carrying his own unprocessed trauma, the terror of being helpless while someone he loved suffered. "You're afraid too," Serafina said softly. "You've been so focused on being strong for Isabella that you never gave yourself permission to grieve Elizabeth's death or process your own fear of loss." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Richard talked about his own pain, the guilt he felt for surviving when she didn't, the helplessness that consumed him during Isabella's attacks, the fear that he was failing as a father. Serafina listened with the same patient understanding she showed Isabella, and Richard found himself experiencing his own form of healing. As the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the penthouse in golden light, Richard made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "Serafina," he said, "I need to tell you something. I'm in love with you." The silence that followed felt eternal. Richard immediately began to backtrack, convinced he had ruined everything. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I don't want to complicate Isabella's healing. If you need to leave—" "Richard," Serafina interrupted, her voice soft but clear, "I am in love with you too." The confession hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying. They both knew that their relationship could not be a typical romance. Isabella's well-being had to come first, always. But they also recognized something profound and real between them, a connection that had grown from shared commitment to healing and had blossomed into something deeper. "What do we do?" Richard asked. "We take it slowly," Serafina replied. "We let Isabella adjust to the idea gradually. We make sure she never feels threatened or replaced. And we remember that love, real love, makes people stronger, not weaker. If we love each other in a way that creates more healing, more peace, more joy in this house, then it's a gift to Isabella, not a threat." The conversation with Isabella came a week later. Richard and Serafina approached it with the same gentle honesty that had characterized all their interactions with her. They explained that they cared deeply for each other and wanted to explore a relationship, but that Isabella's comfort and well-being would always be their first priority. Isabella's reaction surprised them both. "I was wondering when you were going to figure that out," she said, with a 12-year-old's blunt honesty. "You two look at each other the way Mommy and Daddy used to look at each other." Richard felt his heart stop. "Isabella, if this makes you uncomfortable—" "No," Isabella said firmly. "Mommy wouldn't want you to be alone forever. and Serafina isn't trying to replace Mommy. She's just Serafina. She helped me find Mommy's love again, and now she's helping you find love again, too. That's what Serafina does. She helps people find what they thought they lost. 1 year after Serafina first whispered her healing songs in the darkness, Isabella Whitmore was a completely different child. The panic attacks had become so rare that when they occasionally occurred, Isabella could manage them independently using the tools Serafina had taught her. She slept peacefully through most nights, and when she did wake with worry, she knew how to breathe herself back to calm. More importantly, Isabella had developed a relationship with her mother's memory that was a source of strength rather than terror. She kept Elizabeth's picture by her bed and talked to it regularly, sharing her day and asking for guidance. The conversations no longer triggered panic. Instead, they brought comfort and connection. Isabella had also gained something she never expected, a woman who loved her not as a replacement for her mother, but as a unique and precious individual deserving of care and protection. Serafina had never tried to become Isabella's mother. Instead, she had become something equally valuable, a healing presence, a teacher, a guardian of Isabella's heart. The relationship between Richard and Serafina had developed with the same patience and intention that characterized everything Serafina did. They married in a small ceremony in the penthouse garden room, surrounded by the memory plants they had grown together and witnessed by Isabella, who served as maid of honor and declared it the second best day of her life, the first being the day she stopped having panic attacks. But the most profound change was in Richard himself. Serafina's healing presence had helped him process his own grief and trauma, transforming him from a man driven by fear and guilt into someone who could embrace joy and hope again. He still worked hard and maintained his business empire, but he was no longer consumed by the desperate need to control everything. He had learned to trust in healing, in love, in the possibility of recovery even after devastating loss. The story of Isabella's healing spread quietly through Manhattan's elite circles, not as gossip, but as hope. Other families dealing with childhood trauma began seeking Serafina's help, and she eventually established a practice focused on healing children through alternative methods. She never advertised or sought publicity. Her reputation grew through whispered recommendations from grateful parents whose children had found peace through her unique combination of traditional psychology, music therapy, and spiritual healing. Isabella, now 13 and thriving, often helped Serafina with younger children who were struggling with anxiety and loss. She had a particular gift for connecting with kids who felt trapped by their own fear, perhaps because she remembered so clearly what it felt like to believe that peace was impossible. Fear isn't the enemy, Isabella would tell them, echoing Serafina's teaching. Fear is just a messenger that hasn't learned how to whisper yet. Once you teach it to whisper instead of scream, everything changes. The penthouse that had once echoed with cries of terror now filled regularly with the sound of children's laughter, healing music, and the gentle conversations that happen when people feel safe enough to share their deepest pains and highest hopes. On quiet evenings, when the city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows and the chaos of Manhattan seemed far away, Richard would sometimes find Serafina and Isabella in the garden room, tending to their memory plants while soft music played in the background. In these moments, he understood that healing wasn't just about stopping panic attacks or overcoming trauma. It was about creating a life so full of love and purpose that pain became just one note in a larger symphony of meaning. The whispered songs that had once been emergency interventions against terror had become nightly lullabies of gratitude, sung not to chase away fear, but to celebrate the profound truth that love, patience, and understanding could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of wisdom and strength. Isabella Whitmore, the little girl who once clawed at her chest in terror every night, now slept peacefully, dreaming dreams filled with her mother's love, Serafina's wisdom, and her father's protective presence. The panic attacks that had once defined her life had become distant memories, replaced by a deep sense of safety and an unshakable knowledge that she was surrounded by people who would never stop fighting for her healing and happiness. And in the quiet darkness of the Manhattan penthouse, when the city finally fell silent and the moon cast silver light through the windows, Serafina would sometimes still sing her whispered lullabies, not because anyone needed healing anymore, but because some beautiful things are too precious to ever stop sharing.